Thank you so much for joining us and being willing to be our first-person guest today. You have so much to tell us about what you went through during the Holocaust, so we'll start right away, if that's okay with you. So you were nearly 10 years old when the part of Yugoslavia where you lived was occupied by Hungary, and your family's life would be forever changed as a result. But before we turn to that time, let's begin by you telling us a little bit about your family, your community, and, okay, sorry, it's still working, and yourself during those first 10 years.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Yugoslavia was a country only 12 years older than I. It was only founded in 1919. And Subotica, which used to be called Subotica, part of Hungary, was ceded to the new country. Town was about 100,000 people, roughly third Hungarians, third Serbs, and third Croatian tribe that was moved there from when Croatia was also part of Hungary. In that city, there were about 6,000 Jews. Probably 4,000 belonged to a very large Reformed congregation, which in Europe was called Progressive Congregation. In Hungary specifically was called the Neolog Congregation, and the rest of it were very small Orthodox congregations. I certainly had a upper middle class life. We had a maid, a cook, when we got a car, a chauffeur, and my sister and I had a governess, because in the social setting of my parents, it was imperative that we children learn proper High German. So up till age 10, my sister and I spent more time with the governess than with the two parents together, and German was the language. Cars were still a novelty, but the social setting again was that if you could afford a car, you could certainly afford a chauffeur and set up a little place where the chauffeur and his family could live. One of my closest friend's father owned a rug factory, and he drove around in one of these impossibly tiny Fiats, which now you can see on the road. And he was sort of ostracized by the community for not following the social mores of having a driver. So I spent a lot of time in my father's printing plant, getting dirty, of course. We spent a lot of time in the summers on a nearby lake where we usually rented for the summer. My aunt bought a large farm. My father bought a small vineyard. We spent a lot of time there, traveling to Budapest, where on both sides of the family there were relatives, traveling to the Alps. Very rich, entertaining life. School was, at home we spoke Hungarian, school was in Serbian. That and most of the time we spoke German with the governess, which didn't seem to bother us at all. In fact, after my first grade, where I learned my alphabet, which was the Cyrillic alphabet used for Serbian, my sister and I and the governess vacationed in a different place than my parents. And so I wrote letters to my parents with the tools at my disposal. The words were Hungarian, but the letters were Cyrillic. And so when the parents came down from the mountains to visit us, friends came along to see this kid who wrote Hungarian and Serbian. One of the weekly highlights, which Bill Benson always pulls me back if I don't mention it. On Wednesday afternoons, the maids and governesses had half day off. and we were deposited in our paternal grandmother's home, an old sort of farming house with a huge garden, and locked in there for the afternoon, and total mayhem governed, and we did whatever we wanted to do, and our grandmother always laughingly approved it, including tricks like soaking off all the labels of all the conserves and preserves and replacing them on entirely different things.
Grandparents are good for tolerating that kind of thing, yes.
So that was the life. I never had any sense of anti-Semitism. There wasn't much anti-Semitism. The only thing the Yugoslav government was insistent on, Yugoslav government meaning a Serb military oligarchy, there was no rights for the Croats or Slovenes, they tried to separate the Hungarian-speaking Jews from the native Hungarians, because they felt that things like my father's paper exercised an undue influence on this minority which they wanted to repress. But that's the only sense that I remember.
Can you talk a little bit about your father's newspaper? It was very influential.
It was my uncle's newspaper. He started it very, very young, and my father immediately after high school went to work in a huge lumber concern in what was then Croatia, to support him, my uncle who went to study at the University of Budapest. And my uncle came back, married very well, married my Aunt Elizabeth, who came from a family of very wealthy porcelain, brick, and other mills. And so I think largely with my aunt's money, he bought the newspaper, became editor-in-chief. And my father, after the discharge from the Austro-Hungarian army, came to work for him. During the huge inflation period after World War I, my father bought this enormous 2-story high printing press, antique at that time, and there were half a dozen mechanics that kept it running, and I couldn't go to sleep at night until I heard the presses rolling in the background. So that was an integral part of life.
And your mother was a very talented artist.
My mother was a graphic artist. She went to she was very much influenced by her uncle, who was a very famous architect of the Hungarian Art Nouveau style, designed the synagogue and city hall in Subotica, many other buildings all over Hungary. And she went to the Applied Arts or Industrial Arts University rather than the Fine Arts University. She always considered herself a graphic artist, not a fine artist. She traveled quite a bit, France, Italy, Germany, Austria, and many of her lithographs and etchings are from that period. And afterwards, she did largely commercial work. My sister and I sort of squeezed her out of her studio, because there were 2 rooms in the apartment. One was supposed to be the nursery, the other her studio. And after I was born, shortly after I was born, we essentially squeezed her out, and her studio became part of the compound for the 2 of us.
I also understand that as a young person, you were a pretty serious stamp collector, and that was important.
Oh yeah, that was a big enterprise. My father helped quite a bit. He occasionally sent instructions to vendors, advertisers, reporters, etc., who corresponded with the newspaper to always use special stamps rather than the regular stamp. And so I made the round at least once a week. I knew everybody who had incoming mail, and she had a drawer where she put the incoming envelopes. And I trimmed them, soaked the stamps off, sorted them, packaged them, and whenever my father went to either Budapest or Belgrade, I had a shopping list for him. I had tender packages of hundreds of these various Yugoslav stamps and a shopping list of things that I wanted using the catalog. When we had to sell it during the occupation, that's when I found out that you don't sell at the price in the catalog, nor do you buy at the price in the catalog. My father subsidized all of that. So that was a big event in my life when that went up for sale.
So all of that would change in 1941 when Germany invaded Yugoslavia and their ally Hungary then occupied your part of Yugoslavia. And from the very first day, you were really subjected to some profound upheaval. Can you tell us about that?
Well, day number one, my father was expelled at gunpoint from his office. The paper and printing plant were confiscated by the government, and all establishments like that had administrators appointed, most of them reliably rabid anti-Semites. The one who was appointed to manage the plant vowed to pauperize the family. On the first day in office, he closed access to my aunt and my father to the personal accounts of the family and charged the 100+ payroll of the entire plant to that account. So in one swell move, totally took money out of our hands. That was a big shock. That summer was very hard. One correction to your text, which you pointed out, Hungary followed mostly German anti-Semitic laws, except for the so-called numerus clausus law, which preceded Germany by several years. It was promulgated in 1920 in Hungary, restricting the percentage of Jews in establishments of higher education to their proportion in population as a whole, which would be about 6%. Because you have to realize that population on the whole included the 80% of the Hungarian peasants who were essentially slave laborers. You have to read Tolstoy, the Russian writers, to understand how they lived. But anyhow, and higher education started at 5th grade, first year of high school, academic high school, gymnasium, and a competitive exam was required. My father was out of work, and so he spent the entire summer with me, coaching me, and I was one of the 9 who got accepted at high school, which really didn't mean much because you were treated with contempt and disgust and hatred by the teachers, and you didn't learn much at all.
And you learned later that you actually had to pay as well, right?
Yes, a gentleman was compiling a history of the museum, of the high school, and knew me through common friends and asked for a financial contribution. I sent him one and I said, as you go through these papers, could you get me the list of names? And so he sent me back a list of names with a hand note at the bottom. You know, I found something curious. These people had to pay tuition. It was a free government school. Nobody else had to pay, but those who were restricted to it, they had to pay.
So just to come back to that first day, in 1941, so your German governess, the nanny, she took off, right?
She didn't want. She walked out, saying she wasn't going to spend another night in a Jew's house, and walked out.
And so I understand. And so they all, Jews couldn't non-Jews couldn't work for Jews
Right.
anymore, so all of your staff is gone. But you were also forced to house Hungarian military officers.
Yeah, these two rooms that I mentioned before, that were our playroom and sleeping quarters, those were turned over to the billeting Hungarian troops, which turned out to be a very nice choice because all three of them were young lieutenants in the cavalry, and because of their rank, deserved outside quarters. 2 counts and the prince. We tried to address my mother in French. She made it clear that she was not going to act like the gracious hostess, but they offered their butler to help out, and so my mother went to the market with a fully dressed Hungarian hussar sergeant carrying her basket, which was sort of an unusual situation.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you were then, your family is confined to a small portion of the apartment,
right.
and you have these 3 Hungarian military gentlemen
Right.
living there as well. So as difficult as, and that went on for 3 years, is that right?
Right.
And as difficult as those years were, it became even worse in the spring of '44 when Germany moved into occupied Hungary as Hungary was about to capitulate to the Allies. And they moved in also into the area where you lived. So what happened after the Germans move in?
Well, it's termed the German occupation. Exactly 600 German soldiers were involved, and in a matter of 6 weeks, they deported 600,000 Jews. For school groups, I posed a mathematical question: how do 600 soldiers deport 600,000 people? The answer is they didn't have to lift a finger, because the Hungarian state police, the gendarmerie, had a fully prepared, rehearsed plan. They started a small part of it in Novi Sad in 1942, only killing 3,000 people on the streets. But they effected the entire deportation. There was until I got to Auschwitz, I never saw a German soldier. Anyhow, first week, all of the leadership, doctors, lawyers, newspaper people, etc., were picked up at night, taken to a place in the countryside, and eventually shipped to Auschwitz, which we didn't know about. Restrictions became more and more severe. We were directed to move into the ghetto in the city, which was a narrow strip of land adjacent to the freight yards. There was fear of bombing, and always this myth of Jews knowing everything about everybody all the time. The myth was that if they placed the ghetto next to the railroad yards, those yards were not going to be bombed. And so we were there for a few weeks, for I think less than a week, again supervised only by Hungarian gendarmes before we were moved into this village, which was sort of emptied so as to take the Jews from the entire region. And we were there for a week before we went to Auschwitz. One of the worst days of my life was that deportation. I don't know how it was broadcast, that on such and such a day, Jews were going to be expelled from their homes. We lived on the 2nd floor. By the time we got the order, the stairway 2 stories up was lined with people waiting to ransack the apartment. And as we walked out with what we could carry, they screamed, yelled, spat on us as we went out. I don't know who they were. I mean, they were local people, but how they got the news, I never found out.
And these people had been neighbors sort of in the area.
Right. Yep, definitely.
But there was one exception.
Yes. Yes. In 41, we had to let our cook go as we did all the others. Unbeknownst to us, she joined this Malay, went into the apartment, and my sister and I, over the years, sort of tried to recreate the path she took from the kitchen, picking up mother's cookbook, to the bedroom, picking up mother's diary of our early days, to a playroom which still had the big drawers of her artwork, and stuffing a folder with drawings, lithographs, etchings, etc., and carrying all that out. I still don't know how she did, except that she was a huge, very prepossessing woman, and she apparently got away with that.
And she kept that through the war and returned it to you?
She kept it through the war, she returned it to us. Then when we escaped, we had to give it back to her. She sent it out in this early 60s. The cookbook was on special exhibition, on exhibition in the previous special exhibit, and we donated that to the museum.
Mm. So from there, as you're deported from your home or moved out of your home, you're forced into a ghetto. So tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Horrible conditions. One or two families per room, drinking a water fountain, maybe one in every other courtyard, sanitary facilities, medical facilities, almost totally non-existent, food doled out on an odd schedule. Again, our cook managed to bring us some food. The fence was rather porous. People could come in and help out, etc. People could escape out. A couple of my classmates escaped with their mothers, but it's still horrible conditions. And then this small village, Bacsalmash, was even worse. I think we were housed in a chicken coop or something. And when I finally found my aunt and her mother somewhere, I negotiated a small place next to it, outdoors, just large enough for a straw mattress, and that was their living space. Mm.
So I understand that. I said earlier you were born on June 6th. So I understand that June 6th, 1944, which was your 13th birthday,
right,
you received what I understand you call a welcome surprise birthday present.
Yes, I was one of the few who had a working permit to work outside the ghetto, because a former mechanic from the printing plant hired me during the occupation as an apprentice mechanic, and to everybody's great surprise, after we were in the ghetto, he showed up with a permit to work outside. So I left the ghetto every morning and came back at night, and in his place there was a clandestine radio, and we heard the BBC, the knock of the Fifth Symphony, and that announced every broadcast, and then the announcement that the Normandy invasion had started. And I don't want to be selfish or self-promoting, but I could have very well been the first person to bring that news back into the ghetto, because there were so few of us who were allowed out.
So from the ghetto, you were sent to Auschwitz.
Yes.
And you were with your mother, I believe your sister, and your grandmother.
Yes.
And so what happened then?
Well, I don't know how many of you have seen Schindler's List, but there is the scene where by mistake they are sent to Auschwitz. and they are marched out, and there's a nice, long, sloping ramp on which, very dignified fashion, the camera follows as they walk down. There was no such thing. There were the railroad cars and the siding, and the two choices were jump or being thrown out. And melee, everything, dogs barking, guards with whips, soldiers as fierce, inmates as fierce as the soldiers, yelling at you, "Why did you come? Why didn't you listen to the warnings?" etc. Eventually consolidated into lines. My mother and my sister and I passed a mound of suitcases. On top of it sat my grandmother, who had a childhood an accident in her youth and had a leg amputated. She was sitting on top of the suitcases without her artificial leg. And then order came to separate men and women. My mother and sister went one way and I went the other way. Again, we marched in line 4, advancing. A SS officer in white gloves. Several survivors will tell you that Dr. Mendele selected them. I was not introduced to the gentleman, so all I know is that he had white gloves and that he had insignia of Hauptscharführer. But he went like that, which I didn't understand then. I was sent that way. Huge crowds, this enormous cavernous room. We were stripped, naked, shorn of every body hair, disinfected with some horrible solution, a cold shower, thrown some broken down clothes, striped inmate uniforms, even worse shoes. All this taking hours, all this after not having eaten or drank for 7 days before. Eventually marched into the barracks. So that was the introduction. What I still remember about it more than anything else is the stench. The stench of unwashed bodies. What I later soon found out was the stench of the smoke coming from a crematorium, but that is still in my nostrils.
And you were 13 years old.
I was 13 years old. So I was marched into a barrack that you pointed out, which was called the youth barrack. Everybody there was my age. Now Auschwitz is known as an extermination camp, but it was also a huge stockyard. That's the only term that comes to my mind, having seen the Chicago stockyards before. People warehoused to be selected for slave labor. Most people who survived Auschwitz survived because they had been there 4 or 5 days and then shipped out. I was there 5 months. So it became obvious. I mean, you learn very fast. You learn the rules, you learn an old inmate's suggestion that as you go to the once a day run to the latrine to pick up a pebble to have something to wipe yourself with. You also learned that pretty soon made things clear that the daily visits of German civilians and military looking for slave laborers never stopped at the boys' barracks. You know, if you were looking for slave labor to exploit, you would not need a 13-year-old for that purpose. So we were rapidly turning into walking corpses. The camp slang was Musulman. I've never found out the origin of that slang term, but that was it. You learned very fast that people die in spirit and mind long before the body dies. And these walking corpses, walking around, oblivious to everything that's going around them, until one morning they are carted away with the night's dead directly to the crematorium. No point in wasting any more gas on them. They're dead. So they go into the ovens. I found out later that my mother had died that way. So that was what I was looking for. My classmates with whom I was taken, one by one, were dying. What saved me is this horrible German governess that my sister and I tried every ruse to get out from under her as well. At that time in Auschwitz, the capos, the overseers, were German criminals brought from prisons to be the internal guards, because the SS were on the outside. They couldn't guard all the time. So eventually these guys looked for an interpreter, because they only spoke German and most of the kids only spoke Hungarian. So at age 13 you volunteer for things that adults may not be so eager. I volunteered, I became an interpreter. The only reward was that after the inmates were fed from the barrels with one spoon, I was allowed to scrape out the bottom of the barrels. That lasted, I have to reconstruct the dates, but the important date that followed was the day that the gypsy families in the compound were exterminated. That was one night. The following morning, new inmates appeared cleaning out the barracks, etc., and new capos, new overseers appeared, and they were Polish politicals. They had red triangles rather than green triangles. One of them walked over and said he was looking for a German, Polish, Hungarian translator. Well, I've never heard a word of Polish before, but I figured it was a Slavic language like Serbian, and so I volunteered. And that changed my life, because these people, all young intellectuals, college students or slightly older, were determined they would survive, determined they would do something about their survival, and insisted that anyone working for them also have this same drive that they had. So for August, September, and part of October, I was with them as an interpreter, often going to the front of the camp, of the compound, escorting German civilians to where they were interviewing inmates, translating for the inmates, making up things during translation. If I find out they were looking for carpenters, well, anything that any inmate said that could be somehow interpreted that way, I did. So that was one of my duties.
And being an interpreter enabled you to locate your sister, is that right?
Yes, well, yeah. The other things, it just so happened that one of the Polish capos had a inmate girlfriend, who was incarcerated as a capo in one of the women's barracks. So we had to go and see her. How do you go from compound to compound? Well, you form a roof repair brigade. Cart, barrel of pitch, some rolls of roof paper, and the barracks were in such horrible condition, winter was approaching, we got permission. So we went from compound to compound, visiting girlfriends, etc., but also passing information, passing intelligence, and black marketeering. In one of these compounds, I encountered my sister, which is a rare event in Auschwitz. She, as the picture shows, she always had long braids. Now she had about 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters of reddish hair, a summer dress in September, arms and legs raw from the biting wind. So eventually I found out that she was being shipped out. I managed to cash in all my black market goods and converting them to a sweater and scarf and arranged to get it to her before she was shipped out. She also reminded me that I brought her a kilo of margarine, which I expected that she would be dividing with her friends. She told on the Shoah Foundation tape that she ate it in one sitting and got very sick, which is not surprising with the diet that she had. So I could help her that way.
And so you were in Auschwitz for 5 months, and the way you got out in October of '44 and ended up at the satellite camp of Buchenwald was pretty astounding. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Well,
yes. Obviously, 13-year-olds were not being shipped out into labor groups. The Auschwitz capos decided, they tried to locate a safe transport, and that was always a question because the SS occasionally played the game of organizing a transport, putting them on the trains, turning the train around and bringing it back and putting everybody taking everybody to the gas chambers. Some form of diversion for them. Anyhow, they pressed me in the line. I got tattooed, which by that time only outgoing people got tattooed. Incoming inmates didn't get that tattooed. The number was not worth for much longer time. And we arrived after 3 days on trains again, this time at least once a day, allowed to go to the train stopped. You could go out to relieve yourself and maybe have some ersatz coffee or something. Arrive at this camp, the commanding officer speaks, the foreman speaks, the translator speaks, and just before we are dismissed, the foreman comes up to me and says, "What are you doing here? I didn't select you." I was his interpreter in Auschwitz. Well, the capos in Auschwitz coached me at least as thoroughly as presidential candidates get coached before debates, but this was not one of the eventualities that they coached me for. So I had to think fast, and I said, "Well, sir, with this many new people, they thought that you would need another interpreter." And he said, "That's a good idea," and walked away. That wasn't it, because as soon as we were seated, which was a big news for us, the interpreter sat on one side of me, another Hungarian-speaking inmate on the other side, really crowding me in, and started questioning me. "Who are you? Where are you coming from? How come the foreman knows you? How come your clothes are so much better than everybody else's? How come you don't have the stripes cut in your clothes, only a swipe of red paint?" Ours. Yeah. That night, they took me to the capo's room, and the questioning continued. Capo was a German political in camps since 1933, so you can imagine what 11 years of concentration camp does to a person. The camp also had Soviet POWs, because Germany did not honor the Geneva Convention with respect to the Soviet Army. And if one of the orderlies was a gypsy, so they all started questioning me in all of these languages. With the Russian, he tried to check my Polish. We quickly realized that Serbian and Russian are much more closer together than either to Polish, so we switched to a much faster language. The gypsy had heard something about Auschwitz, but never heard the whole story, etc. So at the end of the night, I was accepted into the organization. Worked for a short term on the home detail, and then for a couple months on the assembly line. I don't know when Mercedes-Benz bought Focke-Wulf, which was an old German aircraft factory. These were Focke-Wulf fighter planes. We assembled the wings. 14-hour workday, 6.5 days a week. Every 15 minutes the klaxon sounded, and one wing advanced one station. Hard labor, but food somewhat better, considerably better. The cook was a Czech political who had been a chef in a Prague restaurant before, and everyone who has written about Auschwitz, about Niederorschel, mentions the variety and texture of the food more than the nutritional value of the food.
Interesting. So you were there for more than 6 months,
yes,
until April 45, when you were forced on a death march. And so tell us what that was and where you went.
Okay, we had anticipated that the factory would be closed. We were getting less and less complete pieces. We were turning out less and less complete wings. So on night of March 31st, we were marched out. It's about 150 kilometers to Buchenwald, 10 days. Probably a third of the people dying on the road or attempting to escape. Very hard march. In the process, my arm was broken when I spoke back to a German guard, and he threw his rifle at me, and all I could do is move to protect my head. Eventually, we were encased in this abandoned camp called Berstedt at the foot of the hill where Buchenwald was. We had settled down for the night when suddenly trucks appeared. Trucks and the staff guard appeared, and our guards were replaced by fresh SS guards, and the officers took count of the prisoners. With the officers came an inmate, a capo again with red triangle. He seated himself on the running board of the staff guard and made the body motions that you were accustomed to when one inmate wanted to signal another. So I crept up to him and crouched down, not directly facing him. Do you speak Polish? Yes. Do you have an organization? Yes. Send me one of the organization. I said, yes, I am one. You can talk to me. He said, okay, stall as much as you can. Buchenwald is being emptied. Train loads are the Jewish inmates are being packed into train loads and going somewhere, nobody knows where, if you can't stall. I ran back, and at night I told that to the rest of the organization. Following morning, 3 of the people, one who had been in that camp before, hid in the kilns of the brick yard, and the count came up 3 short. And they kept us there for much of the day, standing much of the day, while portions of the guards were searching. Eventually, for the first time, we heard gunfire. And the SS just got nervous and got us started. So we went up to Buchenwald. It was dark by the time we got to Buchenwald. We just marched in. The couple was greeted by his longtime friends with whom he had served in Buchenwald before. The Soviet POWs were marched one way, we were marched another way. There were no SS inside the camp. And we marched into a barrack, and I collapsed in one of the cots. And 12, 14 hours later, somebody shook me awake to say that the Americans had arrived. So all of my great dreams of participating in the inmate takeover of Buchenwald that everybody was planning petered out. I slept through all of it.
So we unfortunately are pretty much out of time here. So I'm going to turn back to Steve in a moment, and I'm sorry we're not going to have time for questions today, but you can come up afterwards. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I hope you can come back to another First Person program. And as I said at the beginning, we have our First Person program every Wednesday and Thursday through the middle of August. It's our tradition at First Person that the first person has the last word. But before we turn back to Steven, I'm going to let you know 2 things. For all of you who haven't had a chance to ask a question, Steven will remain afterwards. And if you want, you can take a photograph with him. So thank you all again for coming. And I turn to you now, Steven, for the last word.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I want you to take away from this is that I was not supposed to be here. Not because timing schedule and I'm substituting for someone else for today. It's that 80 years ago I was condemned to death. The location was not specified. The manner of execution, whether by a shot in the back, hanging, gassing, exhaustion, hunger, was not specified. The only thing was specified that I and 6 million other of my co-religionists were to die because we were subhuman, because we were vermin that had to be exterminated. That was reinforced, that was announced and executed by the country that everybody in Europe considered the most advanced country in Europe. My parents' library was half in German. The German governess was de rigueur. But the entire government participated in the execution, in the formulation of this order of execution and in the performance of it. So I'm one of the few that survived, and that puts some obligation on me. As a witness, it is my I consider it my responsibility to talk, as difficult as it is sometimes, to remind everyone how far hatred, discrimination, persecution can be carried when it goes unchecked. As Elie Wiesel said, the worst enemy of the oppressed are the unconcerned, the people who do nothing while typically a minority takes over and does the perpetration. So that's my hope, that I can convince some of you that prejudice, discrimination, xenophobia are extremely dangerous, because with the slightest prodding or slightest permission by the government, it can escalate into brutality that the world has never seen. And that's my mission, to do my bit to not necessarily to stop, but to dampen down this escalation of brutality.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.